Tobacco, alcohol, and illicit drugs cost the U.S. $600 billion annually in costs related to crime, lost work productivity, and healthcare, according to the latest statistic from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Drug abuse costs a lot, so I wanted to share with you what I know about the process of addiction with you today. I've never been addicted to a substance myself, but I've personally known people who have been afflicted by substance abuse, which is what drew me to the topic in the first place. So let's thoroughly examine the science behind the process of addiction. First, I wanted to define what the term addiction means in the medical world, discuss why it's a dangerous process, and finally, describe the process of recovery. The American Society of Addiction Medicine's definition for addiction is a primary chronic disease involving brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. In order to better understand this quote, we need to look into a little bit of how the brain works. The brain has many precise chemicals and mechanisms keeping your mood and actions in check, but for now we'll focus on one chemical, dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that makes you feel good every time you get it, and your brain gives you this dopamine as a reward every time you find something that's necessary for survival, such as food, shelter, or a mate. So let's refer to the poster board I prepared today. The brain is made up of millions of cells known as neurons, which are cells that communicate with one another to perform information processing tasks. Dopamine starts in the center and travels up this vein-like pathway known as the axon until it reaches the axon terminal button, which is the little circly thing at the end. When it reaches the button, the dopamine is released into a open space between the next neuron, known as the synapse, and then received by the receiving neuron. This process continues until it arrives at these areas of the brain, but for now I want to focus on the frontal cortex, which is the big one, and the hippocampus, which is this crescent-shaped blue one right here. The frontal cortex is basically what controls your actions and your motivation to do things, and the hippocampus is critical for the formation of new memories. Dopamine is a rewarding substance that motivates you to get whatever it was that caused you to have the dopamine effect in the first place. And so now that we see how dopamine affects the brain, we get to see how substance abuse messes this all up. Which brings me to my second point, the bad side of addiction. When you take in an illicit drug, your brain gets a huge surge of dopamine, much larger than your brain would give for naturally earning it. The action of taking in a drug, when you get that high, is also heavily imprinted on your memory. And your primitive reflex will be to go back to the illicit drug that gave you such a good high in the first place. Unfortunately, the more you take in a substance, the less reward you'll get the less dopamine reward you'll get. Which reminds me of an example my psychology professor used on us last quarter. As you're pushing on the gas, giving yourself huge dopamine surges and illicit drugs, your brain will naturally start to push on the brakes and give you less dopamine. And this creates a downward spiral effect of you getting more for less. And people in this state are incredibly unstable to top it off. Abusers think that the drug is necessary for survival. Well, they're logically aware that the drug is not necessary for survival. They've rewritten their survival drives at this point so that their survival drives just take precedence over their logic. In fact, according to an FBI crime report in 2010, 1.6 million arrests transpired due to drug-related offenses, which translates to roughly one arrest every 19 seconds. I have known personally someone afflicted by substance abuse, and yes, they will resort to crime in order to get drugs. So now that we covered the bad side of addiction, this brings me to my last point: how do you stop it? There is no known cure for addiction, but there is a long process known as recovery, which is the only known remedy. Recovery processes may not be exactly the same for every type of addiction, but the main idea is the same. Recovery involves bringing the addicted through long periods of abstinence, so that as they're pushing on the gas, they let off the gas, and their brain will slowly start to let off the brake and give them more dopamine for healthy reasons, natural reasons. The recovery process can be coupled with medications to reduce withdrawal effects, and I'm sure you've also heard of 12-step programs, which include focusing on God to restore you from your addiction and to make amends to people that you hurt, basically admitting that you can't handle this on your own. And I've also heard of people who quit cold turkey when they're on drugs, but that, ouch. I'm not going to go over detail, but it basically sounds like hell on earth. So, in conclusion, addictions are pain and really entrancing. They make people feel high when in reality they're bringing them low. And the road through recovery is long and difficult, but in the end, it's worth the pain.